Welcome to the Swine Health Black Belt Podcast, the latest swine health research digested for you. My name's Dr. Clayton Johnson, and I'm your host for today's episode. Joining me is Seth Melson from the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. Seth, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me here, Clayton.
Seth, if you would, get us kicked off by giving the audience a little background about yourself.
Yeah, as Clayton said before, my name is Seth Melson. I'm a fourth year student this year at the University of Minnesota. I grew up on a wean-to-finish farm in southern Minnesota and kind of fell in love with pigs that way and have continued on that path throughout vet school.
Very good. And as I understand it, you have come across my brother in your internship careers. Is that correct?
Yes, last summer I interned at Swine Vet Center, and that's kind of where the survey I'm telling you about today came from.
Well, that's good. And I'm especially impressed with the quality of work you have done in spite of my brother's mentorship. And I hope he is listening to hear that wonderful message, Seth. But in all honesty, let's get right down to it. Okay, your research was on rotavirus, if I understand it correctly. And rotavirus obviously is a huge problem for the industry, right? We don't have a commercial vaccine solution. Every farm is infected with rotavirus, at least on the sow farm level. It's a problem. It's a nagging problem for pig farms across America and across the world. Talk to us a little bit about what you evaluated with rotavirus and what producers ultimately can do, if anything, to help control that pathogen.
Yeah, for sure. So rotavirus causes that scouring in the early nursery stage or early in the farrowing house and the nursery stages. And we've had a hard time getting a vaccine for it just because it's a hard thing to isolate and the strains don't protect against each other very well. So two methods that producers have used in the past would be natural plant exposure through two different methods, and that's kind of feedback in a mass batch or rotavirus ice cubes. And I'm going to talk more about the rotavirus ice cubes here today.
Very good. So the principle we're trying to put into play here is we take the actual pathogen from the farm, because all farms are infected and it's pretty easy to tell which pigs have clinical signs of rotavirus disease. We take that pathogen and we use that pathogen as a means of developing antibodies in the sows prior to farrowing. And then those sows theoretically pass those antibodies to their piglets via colostrum and then lactogenic immunity with just the milk itself. And that helps prevent the disease. That's kind of the working theory. Now, it's a theory, but we still see farms struggle with the disease, right? It's a frustrating one because farms will tell you, I'm doing the feedback, the natural plant exposure, right? All the things you're asking of me, the colostrum management, I'm doing it, but the pigs still get sick. So talk to us, Seth, what you kind of learned about the ice cube part of it in particular.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of started down the road of looking at what is actually done in the industry, because you go to different systems and different producers and it's just all over the place on what we do. So trying to figure out what is actually being done and, maybe further down the road, what actually works best. So I basically sent out a survey to as many, veterinarians as I could in the swine industry and really just wanted their response on what do you do? So I had a bunch of questions. I think I had like 20 questions in there about how do you prepare these Rotacubes. And I think it's pretty interesting to read the results of how many different things are done with these Rotacubes.
Did you find, Seth, any producers that are actually measuring the quantity of rotavirus that goes into the Rotacubes, or is everybody just shooting from the hip and collect some of what we assume is rotavirus containing material and make up the ice cubes that way, but don't actually test it? Anybody quantifying what they're doing?
Yeah, people are quantifying it. It's using PCR and using those CT values to really try to find a level that they're at, which is semi-quantitative. But most of the time that's being done. After that, though, the concentration isn't really used. It's just kind of, is that virus there? Is it isn't? Or is it not there? So trying to figure out what dose to really give these sows has been very, very varied. Anywhere from, people are mixing 75% intestines with 25% saline. And then there are people on the other end of the spectrum only doing 10% intestines and 90% saline, which gives you a wide variation of what could be in there. And we just don't know.
Yep. And when we don't know the right dose to give, that's going to infer that we're going to end up with a lot of variation. How about other ingredients that went into the feedback, Seth? You mentioned saline, and then tissues, plus or minus maybe scours. But were there any other ingredients that you found were included in the feedback?
Not specifically in Rotacubes. So in Rotacubes, it's mainly just that saline and that intestinal content blended together. Some people were putting milk replacer in it to kind of get some of that palatability up, probably is the kind of the reason for that. But mostly it's just the saline and the intestines in those cubes.
And then what about the storage of those ice cubes, Seth? Is that mostly just in a regular freezer, or are people putting those in -80? Does it matter?
Depends on the farm, and the most common response you'll get, or that we got in the survey, was that most people are using that fridge freezer combo that you see on farms a lot of times.
Yep.
We really need to investigate the how viable that virus is in some of those freezers, because the fridge freezer combos often go through that freeze thaw cycle because they're
Yep.
frost free, and we don't know how that impacts it. In myco, we know that it, or myco high pneumonia, we know that it has negative impacts on the viability of that pathogen, but we just don't know that in rotavirus.
Yep. I mean, storage is another unknown. So presumably, if we can use it all fresh, maybe we would remove that storage variable at least. Did you hear from producers that they don't use rota cubes, or could you talk maybe about situations where rota cubes are advantageous, and there's something the producers were willing to work through the challenges with storage to utilize versus a situation where fresh makes more sense?
For sure. I think the main reason that rotacubes are kind of used is because in that feedback, when you first start that feedback, if you're doing general feedback, there's going to be a lot of rotavirus in there if you have a rotavirus problem. And then the sows get fed it, they give immunity to the piglets through their colostrum, and then all of a sudden that amount of virus goes down in your feedback. So then you start to see cases of rotavirus go up because you no longer have sows being exposed to that, and you really create this roller coaster. And so that's where Rotacubes have kind of been the advantage, is that you can store those in the freezer over time, and then you can either throw it in with your feedback or just use that alone, depends on what system you're in, to kind of try to mitigate that roller coaster effect.
Yep. And I would tell you, Seth, another thing that I've stumbled upon is not intentionally, but sometimes you've worked with farms for just that reason to make up a big batch of feedback, and you got 4 months worth, something like that in the freezer. Then the farm breaks with PRRS. And it's like, wow, that's really handy that we got a bunch of rota feedback that we know doesn't have PRRS in it that's already sitting in the freezer. So that's always something else as a practitioner. I think about it. If I'm working with a farm that's got a high PRRS outbreak rate, right, a high risk of PRRS, and we're in one of those times where we don't have active wild type PRRS in the farm, we may make some feedback up just so we've got a stockpile of it for that rainy day PRRS event that unfortunately tends to happen occasionally.
It's a very good point. Never even thought about that.
How about administration? Did you ask in your survey about how they administered the cubes? So I got the cubes, I pull them out of the freezer. What do I do with them next?
Yeah, there were kind of three main methods that were, well, four main methods that were being used. Some people were just putting it on top of feed, and that could either be done in the feedback that you're already making, or just alone, depending on the system. Through a backpack sprayer was decently common with just the Rotacube because it's a pretty diluted product. And then through the water medicator, if you had that set up in your cell form or in your GDU, was a pretty common way to do it too.
Okay. What about the timing of administration? Did you ask people in terms of how many weeks pre-farrow they're giving it, or even the number of doses they're given, anything like that you learned?
Yeah, most commonly people were giving it 3 weeks pre-farrow and 6 weeks pre-farrow. But we did see some variation in there, and some people were giving it a week before or 9 weeks before. So they're pretty variable in when they gave it, but most commonly 3 and 6 weeks pre-farrow.
Very good. What about big picture, Seth? We don't know what the dose should be. You found huge variation in the dosage that's being actually created for the cubes. Until we can figure out what it should be, it's kind of hard to drive people to consensus, right? Is there any work that's being done or could be done to help us titrate that dose down to say you need this many logs of rotavirus in a cube, and you can use that cube across this many animals? Anything like that that's being done?
Yeah, in the private sector right now, there are people working on an antibody test to see. we fed this sow the rotavirus. Is she actually responding to it at that dose? And is that getting into colostrum? I think those are really important points that right now we don't have a way to measure those antibodies, specific for rota at least. And so I think that would be really important to do, which is being worked on. But as of now, some people are giving, a cube to 60 sows, which ends up being a quarter of a mil. And is that an effective dose? We don't know. And that's the hard part about rotavirus ice cubes.
As is always the case, one research project leads to another, right?
That's right.
So fantastic job of applying the principles of science. When you start with a researchable question and you just create a new one, there's nothing wrong with that. Well, thank you very much, Seth, for coming on. Appreciate you sharing your feedback on rotavirus, and congrats on the job well done. And to everybody else out there listening in the audience, thank you to listening to the Swine Health Black Belt podcast. If you haven't checked us out on our website, please do so, www.swinehealthblackbelt.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss out on our new episode coming next week. Thanks very much for joining us. And for Seth Melson, I'm Dr. Clayton Johnson. We'll see you next week.
Hey, everyone. We're always searching for the latest and greatest research to share each week. If you have a swine health-related research trial and would like to come on the show to talk about it with me and share it with our audience, feel free to send an email to healthblackbelt@swineit.com, and we would love to take a look at your research.